Hi, everybody. This is Skip Elsheimer, and welcome to the AV Geeks Lunchtime streaming show. We're not live. This is pre-recorded, and otherwise I've been wearing this same shirt for days, like 4 days, and it's ripe. Anyways, it's Friday, so it's Fallout Shelter Friday. I don't know why I said that, except that I have a bunch of films that we can watch about fallout shelters and about working for the civil defense program. The first film we're going to watch is basically what a pain in the butt it is to work in civil defense. And I believe it's a volunteer situation. Or you get like a little bit of money, but it's not like a full-time gig. You're not expected to, do this solely. Like, you're supposed to have another job. So this is Day Without End. Enjoy.
A town in the United States. A town in the nuclear age. It's early evening. Two men sit in an office in the town hall. The mayor of the town, Sam Rice, and Civil Defense Director, Bill Logan.
I think we finally got something going here, Sam. There are still some bugs in it, but at least we're on the way.
Good. What have you got there?
Well, first of all, here's the revised disaster plan I've been working on.
Looks like you've been burning the midnight oil.
Burning it? I run clean dry of this stuff.
Oh.
Sam, one of the main problems we've got to work out is communications.
I thought we were in pretty good shape there.
We're going to need more communications equipment in the emergency operating center.
Well, how much do you figure it'll cost?
Here's the brochure on the unit I think we should have. I know, it's more money than we figured on spending. But communications is one of the most important parts of the whole civil defense system, and we don't have nearly enough.
Even with the federal government's matching funds program. This is going to cost a bundle.
Well, how much is emergency protection worth, Sam? What kind of a price tag do you put on the safety of our wives and kids?
You don't have to sell me. Remember, civil defense is my responsibility to start with. But the council, they think we're spending too much money already.
It's about time they realize that we've got to extend ourselves a little if we're ever going to get any kind of adequate emergency program in this town.
Bill Logan, former officer in the United States Army, now retired, and appointed by Mayor Rice as Civil Defense Director 1 year ago. A man with a difficult job. Emergency, protection against enemy attack, protection against natural disaster. When and if they occur, Bill wants his town to be ready with a well-organized emergency plan. A plan that could save lives and property. Many of the larger municipalities have full-time paid directors. Some civil defense directors serve voluntarily on a part-time basis. Bill Logan is a full-time man, but his workday is never long enough for all the things he has to do. Take today, for instance. 9 a.m., a meeting with Harry Coyle, in charge of shelter management instruction for the town. His problem? Not enough people are taking the shelter management course. Shelter management is one of the most important elements in today's civil defense system. Handling of large groups of people in disaster situations calls for special knowledge of many kinds. Measures against nuclear disaster, in particular, demand completely new techniques and approaches. It was at Civil Defense Director Logan's suggestion that Harry attended a federal civil defense shelter management instruction course so he could come back and teach others. At school, Harry was impressed with the amount of civil defense planning that had been written up for instruction purposes. The possibility of nuclear warfare in our time has produced a library of civil defense studies which anticipates, as far as possible, the nature of the nuclear threat and ways in which its devastating effects might be contained. But if Harry Coyle is going to use this knowledge to good advantage, he's got to have people to teach. Many who are willing to learn say they just can't take the time. I've heard it many times since he became the town's civil defense director. People always had so much to do. Bill has an idea. Maybe if they were to arrange a public presentation, work up a program that would make the people realize how important civil defense was to each of them, they might create more support for civil defense activities. Bill will look into it, just as he will follow up on many other matters during the day. 10 a.m. A visit to the owner of an office building on Main Street to see about the space to which shelter provisions are to be delivered.
Well, suppose we store them over here in these closets. That way I won't have to move any of my storage supplies.
That's no good, Mr. Lorenz. There's not enough room there. What about this section off the lower main corridor?
Can't do it. We use that for temporary rentals. You'd be surprised how many people want space for just a few months.
Isn't there any room at all off that corridor you could make available for the shelter provisions?
I don't see where. Look, don't get me wrong. I'm for civil defense 100%. But I got to think of my business.
Well, now, wait a minute. There, at the other end of the corridor, you've got some space marked development. What's that for?
Well, it's not being used right now. We're keeping that open for future plans. Hey, that's an idea. I could let you put the shelter provisions right in here. After all, civil defense is future plans, isn't it?
I'm glad you see it that way, Mr. Lorenz.
11:15 a.m. A phone call to Herman Bayless, a local mover. Arrangements have to be made to pick up the shelter provisions from the federal warehouse and deliver them to Mr. Lorenz building. Pickup and delivery from warehouse to community shelter, where the provisions will be stored, is the responsibility of the local government. Mr. Bayless is offering the use of one of his trucks without charge, a fact for which Director Logan, ever aware of his limited budget, is very grateful. 11:45 a.m. A visit from Bob Martinson, in charge of radiological training. Radiation detection instruments supplied by the federal government to local communities have arrived. Bob has checked out the equipment and reports it in good order. He also tells Bill that there has been a good turnout for radiological defense classes. 12 noon, a speaking engagement at a luncheon of a local civic group. Often the civil defense director will be called upon to present talks. Here he has an opportunity to discuss local civil defense problems and the need for understanding and support of emergency programs.
I know it's hard for most of us to imagine what an actual nuclear emergency would be like. We'd rather not think about it. But somebody's got to do the thinking and the planning, just in case the need should arise. And as remote as the possibility may seem, it is a possibility. If this country should ever become the victim of a nuclear attack, hundreds, maybe thousands of our towns would be affected. More than anything else, there would be a need, a great need, for protection against dangerous radioactive fallout. Contrary to what a lot of people may think, it is possible for our country to survive a nuclear attack if we are prepared for it with an adequate civil defense. That defense begins right here in our town, in each and every town throughout the country. We all need public fallout shelters, more public fallout shelters. We need equipment for them. We need people trained in the special skills of civil defense. We need the support of our municipal governments. Finally, and most of all, we need a plain, common sense approach to the whole problem of civil defense, instead of a lot of emotional and defeatist attitudes.
1:30 p.m. A meeting with the town engineer to examine a plan for providing emergency services in case normal power sources are not available. Local private utility companies will be checked to determine the extent of their standby facilities. Bill will also contact highway, police, and fire departments to explore means of augmenting their capabilities to meet a possible nuclear emergency or natural disaster. 2:30 p.m. A visit to a local women's club for a meeting with the club officers. The women's club presents a gift to the local emergency organization in the form of a check covering the cost of cots and blankets for one of the town's larger public shelters. Since federal government shelter provisions include only survival items such as food, water, and sanitation equipment, the check for the comfort items is good news to the local civil authorities.
By the way, Mrs. Clark, do you think that some of your other club members might be willing to help us out with the presentation we're planning?
Why, yes, I'm quite sure several of us would be interested.
Good. We're going to need a fairly large place for the presentation.
I think I can help you there, Mr. Logan. My husband is manager of the movie house here in town. I'm sure he'll be able to arrange for you to use the theater.
Fine. We'll want to show a few short films, present some demonstrations, first aid, survival techniques, the kind of thing families should be concerned with. Perhaps some of your other club members or their husbands might be willing to take part if they have some special knowledge that might have some bearing on civil defense.
I majored in psychology in college, Mr. Logan, and I once did a paper on group dynamics. It wasn't directly involved with civil defense, but if there's anything that I can do...
Well, it shouldn't be hard to apply your background in the shelter situation, for instance. Some very thorough psychological studies have been done on mass behavior in shelters. I'm sure you'll be able to make a very interesting contribution to the program.
Perhaps we can run a trailer at the theater, advertising the civil defense presentation.
Say, what about a telephone campaign reminding people of the date?
Good idea. I'd like to see a big turnout for this. A town this size should have more people involved in emergency planning.
Why don't we circulate a questionnaire asking people to list any special skills they may have? I know several of our members have taken courses in home nursing.
Mrs. Sanders' nephew has an amateur radio license. I'm sure he'd be willing to help out.
The Civil Defense Director will try to make use of the talents of every available person who might be able to contribute in some way to emergency preparations. Even hobbies or spare time activities might be constructively put to use in civil defense programs. A shortwave amateur radio operator could serve in the local emergency communications setup. The photographic hobbyist may be enlisted to put together a pictorial presentation of the town's civil defense activities. Bill Logan knows that civil defense is not a one-man job, and that the citizens may possess many possibilities for assistance. "4:30 p.m. A visit to a factory on the outskirts of town. When checked as part of the federal government's National Fallout Shelter Survey Program, this building met government standards as a public shelter. Bill has obtained the owner's signature on a federal license indicating the owner's consent to use the building. "5:15 p.m. On the way back to the office, a call at a firehouse to check on arrangements for a training exercise in rescue operations, which is to be held at the shopping center plaza. Test alerts and exercises must be held periodically. 5:45 p.m. Back at his office, Bill undertakes further administrative details of organizing, planning, and budgeting. In case of nuclear attack, the services of all government agencies and departments of the community might be required simultaneously. New functions not normally a part of regular government must be provided for. The Civil Defense Director, as a representative of the local government, is responsible for seeing that the town is adequately supplied and staffed to meet all emergency needs. 7 p.m. Bill takes some of his problems to his friend and boss, Mayor Rice. The clock on the wall has long since registered the end of the workday, but for men like Bill Logan, deeply involved with civil defense planning for his community, the day has no end. Bill is just one civil defense director in one American town. Those who have taken on civil defense leadership in other municipalities and rural districts throughout the nation may have different problems to cope with, depending on the needs of their communities. But all will share the basic responsibility of protection for their people during emergency. In order to continue doing his job successfully, Bill Logan and all civil defense directors must keep in mind the major objectives of the National Civil Defense Program: to provide fallout protection for all of this nation's citizens, to develop the means to give timely warning to the nation of impending attack and attack hazards, to develop effective control and direction of emergency operations at all levels of government, to establish an effective emergency communication system among governmental authorities and with the public, to develop the capability to collect, evaluate, and disseminate information on radioactive fallout, to develop and operate systems whereby the nature and extent of damage resulting from enemy attack can be evaluated. Within the framework of these objectives, the local civil defense director functions as staff coordinator for his community's emergency planning and operations. The civil defense job is a big one, often frustrating, sometimes rewarding. It's a job that comes with the realities of our time, a challenge that can be met through civil defense leaders who understand the threat and have the ability to prepare their communities to meet it.
Never mind the threat of Soviet radiation and atomic fallout. It's the annoying business owners and the people that just can't be put out to help save society and civilization after an atomic war. It's really fascinating to kind of read between the lines with this. Just like what has to be done to manipulate people to consider well, there's safeguards. We're trying to do safeguards in place, but we need you to help. We need you to contribute. It's interesting, personal sacrifice in, to support the local society, or business sacrifice to support the local society and all that. All right. This next film is also, it's made for people that work in civil defense and work for a specific shelter, and it's about the meetings that they have to have before the shelters are actually used. And the thing is, the shelters at the time were for fallout, but could be used for things like tornadoes. Not for floods, because most of them were underground, but tornadoes and potentially hurricanes when there's not a lot. It's basically dealing with the wind. So here's planning for public shelter entry. Enjoy.
Mr. Johnson, please. Harvey, this is Dave Taylor. I just wanted to remind you of the meeting tonight at the shelter. No, only those staff members who'd be directly involved with the initial entry of the shelter will be there. Well, there's you as operations deputy, Bill Sherman, our supply and maintenance chief, Mrs. Carter, our health and sanitation team leader, and Walter Miller, the new communications man. Joe Cook, our deputy for information and training, is sick and he can't make it. No, you don't have to bring anything, Harvey. We'll have clipboards and writing materials in the shelter for you, and you can make a few notes tonight. All right, fine. We'll see you at 7:30. Goodbye now. Mr. Robbins, this is Dave Taylor, the manager for your shelter. I sent you a letter about assisting Joe Cook with information and training. Well, Joe's sick, and I was wondering if you could make a meeting tonight. Oh, well, this won't be our only meeting, Mr. Robbins. The next one's in 2 weeks. How about coming over and meeting the rest of the staff then? All right, fine. Look, I'll check with you again in about 10 days. All right, goodbye. Oh, have a good trip. Right.
Oh, hi, Dave.
Hi, Harvey. Nice to see you. Planning or socializing?
A little of both.
Oh, hey, Mrs. Carter.
Hi.
Bill?
What's in the jug?
Oh, coffee for everybody.
Good.
Walt Miller not here yet?
Who's that, Walt Miller?
The young fellow works at the Circle Radio TV shop. He's our new communications man. Yeah, let's wait outside for him.
Lovely.
Say, Dave, I was thinking about entry. That's our subject for tonight. I ought to place a member of my security team right here in this doorway to keep an eye on what people are bringing along. And he'll have to be firm about what comes in. I take it that furniture and large boxes of personal effects will have to be left outside here.
That's right, Harvey. You can judge for yourself what's going to take up room and be a real nuisance in a crowded shelter and plan for it. If you can get rid of those things at the door, it'll be a lot easier than dragging them back outside later.
I thought of something else. Why don't you have your wife at the door, Harvey? She could give some help to the women, and she gets along pretty well with children. Make people feel better seeing her here.
It wouldn't hurt to have another woman familiar with staff activities to help out Mrs. Carter anyway.
I think Hazel would like to be included. I'll tell her when I get home.
Fine.
Give her my love.
I will.
Oh, hello, Walter.
Oh, I'm sorry I'm late, Mr. Taylor.
That's all right. I'd like you to meet Mrs. Carter, our health and sanitation
How do you
team
do?
leader.
How are you, Miss Carter?
Harvey Johnson, operations deputy.
Oh, I know, Mr. Johnson.
Good. And Bill Sherman here in charge of supply and maintenance.
Well, good
Hi,
night.
sir. I know you.
All right, let's get started, huh? Oh, this is the key to the door with a couple of extras. We'll give one to you, Harvey.
Thank
And
you very
Bill,
much.
you get one, too. And we'll have to decide on another place to keep one in case any of us don't make it. All right, let's go inside.
Let me try mine, huh?
Be my guest.
Oh, thank you.
Walter, you want to join us at the table, please? All right. The things we're going to discuss on the areas you particular people represent. The rest of the staff isn't here. I thought tonight we should become generally acquainted with the shelter and with the supplies and equipment we'd be working with immediately upon entry. Also what our function should be at that time. As a matter of fact, that's the first important point. You know, any one of you may have to act as shelter manager.
Yes, we should all be capable of filling each other's jobs, just in case one of us doesn't get here.
That's it exactly, Harvey. Now, here is the organizational chart for our shelter. It shows our jobs and our relationship to each other. And this is the order we'd move up to fill any vacant spots in case any of us should fail to arrive. Here are some copies of that for you, which you may have. As an example, we should all know what medical supplies are available. If, for instance, Mrs. Carter doesn't arrive. Now, she happens to be a nurse, but we may have to find someone with first aid training from among the shelter occupants. Also, we could fill any of these slots by selecting people from the shelter.
I can teach everyone what they need to know about operating the radio.
Okay, Walter, that's what we're here for. But tonight I thought we'd just have a general kind of orientation. I don't want to make this too long, but I do want to be sure that each of us understands the other's job. All right, let's go through the shelter now and check out the various duties. I'd like you each to explain your own as you know them. First...
Oh, somebody's duty ought to be to get this place cleaned up, get these nails and scrapes out of here.
I'll take care of that.
Okay.
This is the administrative packet, which will be kept on the shelf here. The first one of us to arrive during an attack should immediately get this packet and follow the instructions inside. You'll find certain items which we've put in here. You have stationery, tablets, pencils, pens, erasers, and so forth.
David, you've already got the registration form.
Yes, and this is important. The registration form should be filled in as quickly as possible by all the occupants. Here is a list of the various technical references we have in the shelter: medical, guide to shelter management, and other civil defense manuals. Our log journal, which will be kept by the administrative clerk, and 2 copies of the shelter operations plan, how we will operate and what we will do.
Dave, I think we should post the organization chart, the SOPs, and the staff duties, along with a map on the bulletin board.
That's a good idea, Harv. Let me make a note of it. Now, we've all seen the shelter already, but let's all walk through together now. Now, this door is the primary entrance and exit for the shelter itself. Just outside this door in the hallway, the radioactive monitors will check for contamination of personnel and equipment. Harvey, you'll have a member of the security team here to direct incoming occupants and keep count as we discussed outside, right? I'll try to be here or nearby myself.
Harvey, I've been thinking about strangers to the community who might find themselves here. Well, if you direct them to me or to some of us who live around here and already know each other, it would be a start toward cooperation and kind of making them feel welcome.
That's a very good idea.
Look, if anybody else has any other ideas, keep bringing them up as we go along. All right.
This is a special chest for valuables and any dangerous items that occupants may bring in upon arrival. Things such as pocket knives or weapons will be left here and a receipt will be issued. That is also part of the security job.
Keeping you pretty busy doing entry, huh, Harvey?
That's right.
Now, communications. As you see, we have a telephone and a small radio transmitter receiver. Walter?
Okay. This is a CB transceiver model S1050 with a frequency range of 26.956 megacycles to 22.255 megacycles, divided into 13 unique channels and utilizing 6 fixed crystal channels for
Walter.
transport. This is a power plug. This is the outlet. And you just plug it in here and then turn it on here. It'll also operate with batteries. Our first job when we get here should be to try to make contact with the control center, either by telephone or by radio. So somebody should be standing by in case I'm not here. We should try to contact control center immediately and let them know our situation.
Okay. Any questions?
Not for me.
We'll have complete practice and technical sessions later, Walter. Now, the telephone is our main line of communication. If it doesn't work, then the radio is our backup. All right, Bill, how about supply?
Well, over here we have containers of government food, health and medical supplies, according to the capacity of the shelter. Also some extras we put in there. We will have to get rid of those crates. Now, the first thing when you enter during an attack, you must check over these supplies. On the bulletin board will be an inventory of all the supplies and equipment in the shelter. Those must be checked over, too. And the supply team will issue anything that's needed immediately for food, sanitation, or any of the extras I mentioned. The medical supplies are Mrs. Carter's bailiwick.
Well, this is a standard medical kit, and it's more than adequate for handling the more common illnesses and injuries. Also, inside are booklets on the treatment and use of medicines. Now, the sanitation team will be responsible immediately for assigning people to keep this place clean and for putting into effect rules for sanitation and personal hygiene.
Another important point when the shelter is entered. Check power, water, sanitary facilities, and emergency items. Be sure that everything is working. Also check heating and ventilation. And this must all be done immediately in case we have to send someone outside the shelter to make repairs. I want to do it before fallout radiation arrives.
Of course, radiological monitoring and checking will take place right after entry. Now, Joe Cook isn't here tonight, so except for information, that just about sums up the various staff duties on entry. Why don't we go in and sit down and discuss it further? As a last thing tonight, I'd like to go over the initial duties of the shelter manager. As I said, any one of you may have to act in that capacity. The manager's primary duty is to coordinate all shelter activities and to make final decisions when necessary, not becoming so involved in every tiny detail in each case that he can't be objective. The manager should establish his authority immediately upon entry by introducing himself. And since he'll be one of the few persons who knows what to expect, he should display confidence and relative calmness.
Well, as we all should.
Then, as soon as possible, the manager should get the attention of the entire shelter group and speak to them, reassuring them of their safety from radiation, as long as they remain within the shelter, and also what to expect while in here.
Well, the more the occupants know about the shelter and shelter living, the more confident they'll be.
Right, Harvey. So, one of our first duties is an orientation for the occupants to help them get settled and learn where everything is. Then I'll introduce each of you and explain your specific duty. I'll make it clear that our shelter offers us adequate protection. Our supplies and equipment are adequate, and they certainly should know this. Then we'll give them a briefing on our standing operating procedures, rules for safety and health, and a tentative daily schedule. The registration form should be filled in as quickly as possible by all the occupants. The administrative clerk will collect them and analyze them so that the occupants can be given responsibilities.
We'll also want them to start thinking about representatives to the advisory committee.
Then we'll make a firm daily schedule through discussions with the advisory committee and the entire shelter group. Now, we'll have a copy of this in the administrative packet for your reference. I hope you'll think about what we've talked about tonight and come up with some additional ideas. Especially develop in your own minds what you're going to do first upon entry. As a matter of fact, I think it'd be a good idea right now if you'd make some notes on your specific activities based on what we went through tonight. Now, first, remember the administrative pack with the standing operating procedures and the registration forms. Next, keep in mind security watch at the door. We want to be certain all the people get in and settled as quickly and calmly as possible. Also, Harvey, the safety chest for valuables and any dangerous items. Then, we have the telephone and Walt's radio set for communications, making contact with headquarters as soon as possible.
Although Mr. Sherman is in charge of supplies and facilities, remember that Mrs. Carter has to check all the medical supplies and the sanitation setup right away. We have to know that everything is in place and working order.
I'm sure each one of you could do a creditable job as acting shelter manager, and I'm sure you'll cooperate with me or whomever takes my place. If I'm late, I'll simply take up where the acting shelter manager left off.
I think we're pretty well squared away for the first meeting, David.
David, is this supply list complete to date?
Yes, it is, Mrs. Carter. Oh, one more thing before you go. Here's a list of various items we might want the people to bring in if they care to. Things like blankets, extra food, and so forth. Why don't you all just take a copy? Okay, that just about wraps it up. We'll all meet here together with Mr. Robbins in 2 weeks at 7:30 on the 23rd. I'll give you a phone call on the Monday of that week just to remind you. Good night, Bill.
Good night, Dave.
Thanks for coming.
Good night,
So long,
David.
Harry.
So long,
Bye,
Dave.
bye-bye. Bye, Walter. See you again.
Thank you.
A lot of paper push in there. So I'm sure that the Civil Defense Administration was like, well, how do we show them how to do a meeting? Well, why don't we just show them a meeting? And then they'll glean from it. I love, so these are fascinating films for me because it's all about, like, how do we maintain our civilization and our structure when everything's blown to hell outside. Like, how does that happen? And so these are steps towards that direction. And of course, you have to have office supplies, and you have to fill out forms, and you have to tell people not to bring their personal belongings in. Like, all that stuff is really, it's like, what do you take on a lifeboat? It's the same type of thing. It's really fascinating to kind of see these exercises and these ideas. This last film that we are going to watch is Radioactive Fallout and Shelter. And it gives you some helpful tips on how to deal with radioactive fallout that has made it into your daily life. Like, how do you deal with food that has fallout shelter on, or has fallout on it, not fallout shelter? And how do you do these other things? And this is part of a series. It's kind of a self-help medical series that was showing first aid, was also showing infant care and kid care, and it was basically shown to say, like, you might be somewhere where there's not a doctor, and you might not be able to get access to a doctor for 2 weeks. So what can we do to help the average citizen cope and deal with things? And it's fascinating. It's really kind of an interesting thing. So here is Radioactive Fallout and Shelter. Enjoy.
Medical self-help is an emergency measure to be used only in cases of sudden or extraordinary misfortune. If people require medical care in the course of normal, everyday living, they should always be treated by a doctor. However, when disaster strikes, you may not be able to obtain trained medical aid in time. There are many forms of disaster. They can happen to you and your family at any moment. This film is one of a series on medical self-help. Its purpose is to teach you what to do in an emergency situation when there is no doctor.
This powerful X-ray machine, a tool of medical science, is being used for healing purposes. The radiant energy it emits is able to kill all living tissue within its beam, both sick and healthy cells of the human body. Its invisible rays so highly penetrative that protective shielding with lead glass windows must be used. X-rays are much like the gamma rays of radioactive fallout. We began our picture with X-rays because you are all to some degree familiar with their effects. But radioactive fallout is another matter. If you're like most people, it creates many questions in your mind, and you have doubtless read or heard some falsehoods and misconceptions. This film will tell you what you need to know about fallout, so that if our country is ever subjected to a nuclear attack, you can help yourself and your family to survive its dangers. For fallout is probably the most dangerous product of nuclear disaster in terms of the number of people who could be affected. It is also the one from which we are best able to protect ourselves. Let's examine what happens when a nuclear weapon is exploded near the Earth. First, there is blast, or the pressure wave created by the explosion, along with heat, the most intense ever created on Earth. Both will extend great distances from the point of the explosion, from 1 to 20 or 25 miles, depending on the size of the weapon. However, the further away you are from the site of the explosion, the less are the chances you will suffer the fatal effects of blast and heat. There is yet a third immediate result of a nuclear detonation: initial radiation. The final effect is residual radiation, the main concern of this film, or radiation that follows the explosion, and one that may remain at high altitudes for some time before falling back to Earth. What exactly is residual radiation? Our sun, like other stellar bodies of the universe, is a giant nuclear furnace burning at temperatures of millions of degrees, while emitting various types of radiation. Among these are gamma rays, shorter in wavelength than their closest neighbor, X-rays. The Earth's atmosphere prevents these radiations, dangerous to the health of man and animal, from reaching our planet. However, when a nuclear weapon is exploded, man is creating on Earth, in the splitting of atomic nuclei, his own nuclear furnace to produce the gamma and beta radiations of outer space. Let's see now just how this radiation is created. At the time of the burst, vast amounts of dirt, stone, and other debris, vaporized by the heat of the explosion, are sucked up into the rising cloud. As the mushroom cloud forms, these particles are made radioactive, for as they cool and condense, they are contaminated by residue from the bomb. These particles, when they fall back to Earth, are what we call radioactive fallout. Can you or anyone else predict with accuracy the pattern by which fallout particles will return to Earth? The answer is no, for fallout will depend on the number, size, and location of nuclear weapons exploded and the direction of upper air currents. Let's, for example, explore the fallout produced by one of these nuclear weapons. It sends its column of radioactive material up to 80,000 feet, or about 16 miles or more above the Earth. Here, the radioactive particles, beginning to drift downward, are at the mercy of upper air currents that vary from day to day. Descending at various altitudes through many different layers of air that may be moving at varying speeds and directions. Thus, winds on the surface of the Earth give little help in determining the direction or the occurrence of fallout. Meteorologists, with their special instruments, however, can appraise altitudes as well as the total distance fallout will be carried. In a nuclear attack, keep tuned to your local radio station. It will keep you posted where fallout is taking place and its approximate amounts. Though you may be able to see this dust once it reaches the Earth, you cannot see or detect the radiation it emits without the aid of radiological instruments. Nor can you taste, smell, or feel this radiation. Why is fallout so dangerous to human and animal life? because each particle gives off radiation as if it were a tiny X-ray machine. This radiation consists mainly of gamma rays, which are extremely penetrating. Like X-rays, gamma rays are able to injure, even destroy the cells of our body if we are exposed to a sufficient dosage long enough, or if we eat or drink material contaminated by fallout particles. Exposure to gamma rays can make you sick, can even cause death. However, no matter how long one may be exposed to fallout, he does not become radioactive, nor can anyone catch radiation sickness from him like a contagious disease. In fact, this radiation cannot make anyone or anything radioactive. Now let us suppose that fallout has descended on this can. We'll let salt represent fallout dust. The particles don't go through the tin. The radiation does, but radiation is harmless to all except living materials. It has no effect on the food inside. Now, if you wipe away the fallout particles, or better still, wash them away, the food inside cannot be contaminated and is perfectly safe to eat. The same is true of all foods and liquids that have been protected by packagings or containers, even the thinnest layer of cellophane. If you don't swallow the dust, there is no ill effect. If water for washing is in short supply, canned goods that may have been exposed to fallout can be handled safely with a piece of paper towel. Use one sheet of paper to lift the can and turn it upside down. There is no dust on the bottom. Now dispose of the paper. Wipe the sides of the can with a new piece of towel. And don't forget to put the contaminated paper in a covered receptacle. Now open the clean top. There will be no harmful particles in the food itself. A sealed loaf of bread that has been exposed to fallout can be salvaged in a similar manner. Turn the loaf upside down to expose the bottom, which will be clear of dust. Then dispose of the towel. Now insert a sharp knife through the wax paper at the center of the loaf and cut upwards, making a slot 4 or 5 inches lengthwise. Insert your fingers through the slot and rip the paper slowly open. The bread can be safely removed to a clean place. Finally, dispose of the wax paper. Contaminated vegetables, such as potatoes, can be pared like this. Use a clean piece of newspaper and, working first in one corner, cut off one end. Move to a clean surface of the paper and peel in this manner. Move to another area of the paper and remove the other end. Dispose of all peelings and soiled paper carefully. After handling any contaminated food containers or vegetables, wash your hands. Fallout dust is dangerous, but it can be dealt with by following safe procedures. There is another widespread legend, the fear that fallout spells death to all life on Earth. The plain fact is that even if a great number of nuclear weapons were exploded, the resulting fallout would cover only a small area of the world's total land mass. The real concern then is this: if we are in that area, how do we protect ourselves? Like X-rays, radiation from fallout can go through almost every kind of building material. Over 99% would pass through glass, 66% through wood sheathing, 50% through a brick veneer wall. But only 1% of gamma radiation would penetrate 18 inches of concrete. And though it's not a building material, it's important to know that only 1% would pass through 25 inches of earth. Quite aside from the shielding effect of building materials, the intensity of radiation decreases with the square of the distance from the source. Thus, 10 feet away from a particle of fallout, the radiation rate is only 1% of that encountered at a distance of 1 foot. Other things being equal, the central parts of a building are safer. The radiation rate, or the intensity from fallout, decreases with the passage of time. In fact, for every 7-fold increase in time, the radiation will be reduced by a factor of 10. That means that at 7 hours after the explosion, the radiation level will be about 10% of its intensity at 1 hour. At 49 hours, it will be about 1%. Within 2 weeks, the radiation rate can be expected to decay to about 1/10 of 1%. Therefore, the most vital period to seek protection from fallout is the first few days after nuclear attack, even more so the first few hours. But remember, even with the passage of time, a low level of radiation can be dangerous. That is why you may need to remain within a sheltered area for as long as 2 weeks. These, then, are the 3 basic factors in protection against fallout: time, distance, and shielding. Time, meaning the longer you stay protected from fallout, the safer you will be. Distance, or the further away you get from fallout, the safer you will be. Shielding, meaning the more mass or weight you put between yourself and fallout, the safer you will be. You have often seen this sign on buildings. It means that indoors is a public fallout shelter, one of many and various kinds of buildings in your community that are similarly identified. Architects and engineers have carefully surveyed the shielding qualities of these areas to ensure they offer a minimum protection factor of 40 or more, meaning that in the event of fallout from a nuclear explosion, the mass and weight this shelter will place between you and the source of radiation will make you at least 40 times safer than if you were outdoors. Each of these shelters will hold at least 50 people and has been stocked by the government with austere supplies: food, water, sanitation equipment, medical kits, and radiological instruments. But what about millions who live in suburbs or rural areas, often far beyond quick walking distance of the nearest public shelter? With foresight, you can have a home shelter for the protection of your family, built from specifications and cost estimates for various types of shelters provided by your local civil defense office. The home shelter should be stocked with supplies of food and water sufficient for 2 weeks. Here you are afforded time, distance, and shielding if and when fallout, so dangerous to human health, should ever occur in your community. Just how much radiation can you receive without becoming sick? We measure exposure to gamma radiation from fallout in units called Roentgen. They're the same units used to measure X-rays, named for Wilhelm Conrad Roentgen, the discoverer of X-rays. People and animals may develop radiation sickness if they have been exposed to large amounts of radiation over a short period of time. Few people become sick who have been exposed to a total radiation dose of 100 Roentgens or less. However, exposure to more than 300 Roentgens over a period of a few days will cause sickness, may cause death. And if you receive an exposure of 600 Roentgens in that same period of time, death is almost certain. How can you tell just how much radiation you've been exposed to? These are the instruments commonly used to detect and measure radiation. They are part of the equipment supplied to the radiological monitoring team of every public shelter. With them, you can determine not only the total amounts of radiation received, but also the dose rate per unit of time, or the dose rate in Roentgens per hour. This is the dosimeter, conveniently shaped to be worn on one's person at all times. It is able to measure the total accumulated radiation exposure in Roentgen. The charger adjusts the dosimeter to a zero reading prior to its use, with each separate exposure to radiation building cumulatively on the dosimeter gauge so that a reading of the total dose is available at any given time. Next, the Geiger counter. This instrument measures radiation in fractions of Roentgens per hour within or outside the shelter. Finally, the survey meter, able to measure higher intensities of radiation that may exist outside the shelter. For home shelters, detection and measuring instruments are available from commercial sources. However, most householders will rely chiefly on their portable radios to receive readings as they are taken by civil defense monitoring teams. If there is a nuclear attack and you survive the initial effects of an explosion, you will have at least a half hour to get to a public or home fallout shelter. Therefore, to be safe from radiation sickness, get into the best available shelter as soon as possible. Once there, stay put, because each time you're exposed to fallout radiation over a period of a few days, the dosage continues to build until it reaches dangerous quantities. If you're among those compelled to travel through a fallout area on essential errands, there are certain rules to follow. Protect your body with boots or rubbers, gloves, headgear, and outer clothing that can be removed before you re-enter the shelter. On returning, brush off the rest of your clothing thoroughly, as well as any parts of your body that may have been exposed to fallout. If sufficient water is available, wash your face and hands carefully. Remember, these are the dosages of radiation as they affect human health. 100 Roentgens, little or no effects. 300 Roentgens, sickness or death. 600 Roentgens, death. Recovery from radiation sickness is nothing new. Patients who are treated by X-rays routinely experience this sickness and get over it. Of course, the dosages they receive are carefully measured. Just as in combating the virus of the common cold, your general state of health will often govern how quickly you can throw off the effects of mild or moderate radiation sickness. In an emergency situation where there is no doctor, always treat radiation sickness by treating its symptoms. In fact, these symptoms are often similar to those produced by extreme anxiety or emotional stress. So it's best not to try to determine their cause. I repeat, do not try to diagnose. Merely treat the symptoms, just as you would if they were the result of any other type of illness. These are the symptoms of mild as well as moderate radiation sickness, one or more of which may appear shortly after exposure to fallout. fatigue, loss of appetite, nausea, vomiting, prostration. The treatment is rest. For nausea, you may give the patient any of the commercial preparations that settle an upset stomach, or 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda in a cup of water. Tea and other hot liquids may be helpful. When a high fever is present, apply cold wet packs. Aspirin also tends to reduce a fever. In severe radiation sickness, along with the early symptoms, other symptoms may appear a week or more after exposure. Recovery is possible, but it'll take longer. The symptoms are diarrhea, inflammation of mouth and throat, loss of hair. For treatment, control the diarrhea and give aspirin and warm water gargles. People are naturally alarmed at the thought of bodily changes that may follow severe radiation sickness, such as loss of hair or sterility. These conditions are usually temporary and will disappear with recovery. So I hope we've dispelled another commonly held myth. You can get over radiation sickness just as you get over many others. Nevertheless, don't minimize the danger of fallout. Remember, its effects are cumulative. The only real protection against it is to take shelter. Now, let's review some of the outstanding facts we have learned in this brief exploration of a vitally important subject. Fallout is composed of trillions of particles of dust that are made radioactive by residue from the nuclear weapon during the aftermath of the explosion. In a nuclear attack, depend on your local radio station to tell you where fallout is taking place. You may be able to see some of the fallout dust when it reaches the earth, but you cannot taste, smell, or feel the radiation itself. The gamma rays given off by fallout are able to injure or destroy the living cells of our body if we are exposed long enough. Food or water in containers that prevent contamination by fallout dust is perfectly safe. Radiation is harmful only to living tissues. Packaged foods that have been exposed to fallout should be opened carefully. By following proper procedures, you can eat such foods without danger to health. Radiation can pass through most building materials, but its intensity is diminished in proportion to the weight and mass of the material or the shielding. The intensity also decreases with distance from the fallout. The radiation rate will decrease or decay rapidly with time. It is most dangerous in the first few days after explosion. Thus, the three basic factors that protect you from fallout radiation are time, distance, and shielding. You should know the location of the nearest public shelter in your community. Inside it, you will be at least 40 times safer from fallout than you would be outdoors. And it has been stocked with supplies to sustain its occupants for up to 2 weeks. If you're not within walking distance of a public shelter, you can provide a satisfactory home shelter for your family. Radiation is invisible, but we have accurate instruments with which to measure it in Roentgen units. The dosimeter can be worn on the person and measures the accumulated radiation exposure, the total dose at any given time. The Geiger counter measures radiation in fractions of Roentgens per hour, inside or outside the shelter. The survey meter is used to measure the higher intensities of radiation that may be present outside the shelter. Assuming that you have the protection of a good shelter within a half hour after nuclear attack, you will probably have little or no radiation sickness. If there are victims who appear to have radiation sickness, do not diagnose. Treat the symptoms. Perhaps the most important thing you have learned is to see the danger in its true perspective. Make no mistake, nuclear attack would be a terrible catastrophe. Millions of our people would be killed by the initial blast and heat. Millions more would be threatened by death from radioactive fallout. But that is a threat that can be combated. Can, with knowledge, preparation, and courage, be faced and conquered.
Yeah. Kind of a quick primer on what to do if you're exposed to radioactivity, just for the layman, not for the doctor. And it's not a salve. It's not a magic salve. Basically, they say, yeah, a bunch of people will die, but some other people that could die from getting exposure to fallout, we can help them. So, it was a fascinating time during the Cold War, and there's still lessons to be learned there, obviously. So, thanks for joining us today. Have a great weekend. If you like what you saw, thumbs up or hit the like button. Even if you were mildly intrigued by what we were showing. We don't always just show atomic and fallout shelter films. We show a variety of different things. And we'll be back live on Monday. But if you like what you saw, you can also buy us coffee at ko-fi.com/avgeeks. I hope everybody has a great weekend, and we'll be back on Monday. Everybody take care. Bye.